Hello, and welcome to Hospice Insights, the law and beyond, where we connect you to what matters in the ever-changing world of hospice and palliative care. Welcome, Andrew. It's great to see you. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So we're talking today about building in redundancies and insights we have on how to avoid written certification denials, or maybe even a finer point is when, there's a failure in your primary way of doing that, things that in our experience has been helpful as we've worked with clients through internal investigations and other appeals. What has been other helpful documentation that we've looked to primarily support the prognosis statement language of the certification requirement. And so these issues, I think, for us have come up oftentimes in the context of EMRs, and a lot on how humans may use those procedures to document different elements.
Yeah, that's right. Whether it be sort of something within how the EMR was configured or how, hospice staff sort of used the EMR. Oftentimes we see in our investigations, just like you said, problems with the certification documentation where, one of the many Medicare certification requirements is missing or otherwise kind of facially deficient. So kind of one of the things we do then is kind of look and see elsewhere in the record if another document, supports the certification standards. And just like you said, I think kind of the most important content element that we would try to look for in that case would be the prognosis statement.
Which, when we say prognosis statement, we mean the 6-month prognosis language.
Yep.
And I think as we work with clients, we have found that many do build in these redundancies. So the first thing we oftentimes look at is narratives, because as a matter of course, many physicians actually say, right, because the narrative is saying why this person is terminally ill. They'll start out their narrative or end it with, this person has a 6-month prognosis or less because, of XYZ. And that's been really helpful.
Yep. Yeah, that has been very helpful in some of our investigations, kind of having that redundant prognosis statement. Absolutely.
It could be useful for folks to work with their physicians and train them, like, this is the question you're answering when you're writing a narrative. So start with that. And it gives you the right frame of mind. Or even if you have your narrative form, right? Everyone has a form for their narrative. And oftentimes it will have a description that says, brief narrative, like, this is a brief narrative as to why the person has a 6-month prognosis or less. And if you had that language above it, and they signed it, that's another way to sort of get at that, because that's a natural document where no one writes a narrative if they don't think they're terminally ill. So I think the mere act of doing that is evidence of that. But obviously making that prognosis language a little bit more clear. The next thing we look at oftentimes is plans of care, because while certifications aren't necessarily in order, I do think in our experience working with a lot of different clients, it does get plugged in sometimes as an order with other orders on the plan of care. And so if there's a prognosis statement there, that can be helpful.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And if the hospice is creating or updating the plan of care, I mean, clearly the physician in that case, would have considered the patient to be terminally ill. So including that 6-month or less kind of full prognosis statement, would seem to make sense there. And if you kind of go down that route of trying to build in some redundancy within the plan of care, a couple things to kind of keep in mind. If you did want to use that document as a redundant certification down the road, if you were kind of forced into that position, you'd want the physician to sign that document. Also, the timing of when the physician would sign the plan of care, that could impact kind of how we would use that, because of course there are timing requirements related to the certification, and whether the physician signed the plan of care kind of within those time frames would be something that we'd have to look at too. But yeah, generally,
there's so many complications with these, and that's why these redundancies aren't foolproof, but because you need to look at all these other elements, as you say, to these certifications, which there's so many I dotting, T crossing things to this, but it can be very, very helpful. And I think another place we look is face-to-face visit notes. Now, many hospices use primarily nurse practitioners to do that, but if you are having hospice physicians do that. Now, if they're the certifying physician, they may not do a full visit note. But if they are, also building in that, like this person has a 6-month prognosis or appears to have a 6-month prognosis, as evidenced by, these types of things, because that note is really assessing them about, do they continue to demonstrate that limited life expectancy? So that's another place that has been helpful for us.
Yep, absolutely. And kind of getting at that complexity we were talking about, of course, the face-to-face visit can be completed up to 30 days before the benefit period, whereas the certification itself can be completed up to only 15 days. So again, just another kind of layer on top of all of this. But if you were to try to use that face-to-face visit note as a redundant certification, the dates would have to line up such that it would be timely from a certification perspective.
A couple other places that I think are more one-off, and I don't know that I would put them on my short list, but some people, and similar to the plan of care, have a physician order that's like a certification, so that might be another place to look. And then the verbal certification. Now, it's very clear through guidance, and I think well accepted, that verbal certification does not need to be signed. And I think we always suggest the verbal certification should actually be spelled out, like use the prognosis statement there. While not required, we do see some people, as a matter of practice, have physicians sign off on that verbal certification. And so if that's something you do, that's also a place you could look if, again, human error led to your primary way of documenting written certifications. This could be another way to prove that. I think, I'm not a hospice operator, but I do think, right, we're trying to cut down on how many things people have to sign. So if we're having people sign off on things that aren't necessarily required, that's why I think our short list started with things that physicians are already having to sign that are directly connected to their determination that someone has a 6-month prognosis. And so, this is sort of the quick hits. I think, as you hinted at, Andrew, there's a lot of complexity when we've had to dig into these issues. And so, but I think we have found a lot of clients have done some great training with their physicians around what question are you always answering, and what is it that you're thinking about? And it's always about, why does this person have a 6-month prognosis? And so spelling that out more times than once can be helpful when, again, your primary system maybe falls short in an isolated instance or whatnot. But any closing thoughts, Andrew?
Well, just that I think your last point about balance is important. So, it's great to kind of build in all these redundancies in that kind of worst case scenario where we have to defend something, whether from a appeal perspective or from just an internal investigation perspective. But that doesn't mean necessarily that you should kind of be completely revamping how you're kind of completing all these documents just so that you are kind of setting yourself up to in this worst case scenario defend yourself. So it's kind of a balance, things to consider, not necessarily just to kind of slapdash execute all at once.
Well, and a podcast that hasn't yet been released that we recorded earlier this week, it really talking about education fatigue and like it was in the context of TPE and throwing a bunch of changes at people all the time, like we could do this better, we can do this better, and it's sort of picking and choosing what makes sense and what's going to move the mark the most. And I think this is similar, like just because you listen to this podcast, now I'm going to create 5 new systems for redundancies. But hopefully there's some nuggets here that might be helpful, because as we're saying, all of these concepts we're talking about, physicians are already doing an action that is indicative that they believe this person has a 6-month prognosis, and so building in that language can be helpful when you're training them, and it keeps them focused on what matters. So well, thanks for the insights, Andrew, and look forward to next time.
Yeah, me too.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Hospice Insights, The Law and Beyond. Thank you for joining the conversation. To subscribe to our podcast, visit our website at hushblackwell.com or sign up wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, may the wind be at your back.